Vážené dámy a páni, dobré ráno. Dovolte, aby som vám predstavil, ja som Petr Janeček, budem moderátor na dneskajšiu diskusiu o migrácii v rozmanitosti, prepáčte. A naša diskusia bude v angličtine. Dovolte mi, aby som vám predstavil našich hostí dnes ráno. Začnem s Saundersom, ktorý he writes for the Global Mail's International Affairs column and also serves as the paper's online opinion and debate editor. He has been writing for the Globe since 1995 and has an extensive experience as a foreign correspondent, having run the Globe's foreign bureaus in Los Angeles and London. Born in Hamilton, Ontario, and educated in Toronto. That means York University, the school I went to as well. After early success in magazines and journalistic research, he first worked for the Global Mail as a general newspaper reporter, then as an editorial writer and feature writer. In 1996, he joined the Weekend section, where he created a specialized writing position on media, culture, advertising, and popular phenomena. In 1999, he became the paper's Los Angeles bureau reporter, covering both social and political stories in the American West and the broader development in wider U.S. society. From 2003 until 2012, he was the paper's London-based European bureau chief, responsible for the paper's coverage of more than 40 countries. He has also done extensive reporting in the Middle East, North America, the Indian subcontinent, and East Asia. He has won the National Newspaper Award, the Canadian counterpart to the Pulitzer Prize, and on 5 occasions, including an unprecedented 3 consecutive awards for critical writing in 1998 to 2000, and awards honoring him as Canada's best columnist in 2006 and 2013. He has also won the Stanley McDowell Prize for Writing and has been shortlisted for a National Magazine Award. He has published 2 books. His first, Rival City, chronicled the unprecedented wave of rural to urban migration and the rise of urban immigrant enclaves using first-hand reporting on 5 continents. It has been published in 8 languages and has won numerous honors, including the Donald Prize for Best Book on Politics and runner-up for the Gelber Prize for the world's best international affairs book. His second, The Myth of the Muslim Tide, published in 2012, examining the effects of immigration from Islamic countries to the West and has been published to acclaim in Canada, the United States, and Germany. To his right, Tom Nicholson is known to most of Slovaks as journalist who wrote a book about guerrilla scandal. He came to Canada to teach English and French in the 1990s. He has been with the Slovak Spectator, country's first and only English language weekly from 1997 to 2003 and 2004 to 2007, working as a reporter, then as an editor. He was appointed editor-in-chief in 1998 and publisher in 2001. After taking a leave from the paper from 2002 to 2004, where he worked as news editor for Kingston Week Standard, he rejoined it as publisher and editor of the SPEX Specs magazine. In 2007, he left the Spectator to lead an investigative program at the SMED daily paper, followed by a short spell in the Trend Weekly. He holds a master's degree in history from Queen's University, that's in Canada, and has worked for Week Standard, Canada's oldest daily paper, and National Post dailies. Tom also had his articles published in the Financial Times, Ottawa Citizen, Globe and Mail, and Business New York. After publishing a bestseller called Guerrilla, as you all know, working as freelancer and reporting on how the power is used in Slovakia, and also managed the Civic Association organization on the surface. In 2007, he received the Journalism Award, the Open Society Foundation, in the Best Commentary category for his commentaries. Zuzana Vatralova has served as head of IOM, International Organization for Migration, in the Slovak Republic since 2004. In 2003, she worked at IOM as a coordinator of information campaign on preventing human trafficking in Slovakia. From 1997 to 2002, she worked as a reporter for BBC Bratislava and London. Prior to that, she has been a project manager at the National Agency for Development of Small and Medium Enterprises, and she had also worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Slovak Republic. We also asked people from the Ministry of Interior that tried very hard to find somebody to join this morning. Unfortunately, we weren't successful. We start our program with Doug, who will say a few words, explain how multiculturalism and migration has worked in Canada, and perhaps focus on a few European countries as well. Go ahead.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'm going to talk broadly about what makes immigration fail and what makes immigration succeed. And I think this is a question that has become a very large European question at the moment. Most of the larger European countries now, with a few notable exceptions, now have political parties that are devoted to opposing immigration or to opposing certain specific immigrant groups. These parties have won 1/5 of the votes in Austria, in France, in the Netherlands recently, and in Hungary they've become very powerful forces, in Greece and so on. They've not become a majority or a governing party in any country to this point, but there remains a lot of political anger about immigration, and a sense in many countries that it has failed, that it's creating parallel societies in which there are classes of people or groups of people who exist in their own world that do not share the values of the culture around them, or that are a criminal threat, and so on. At the same time, a lot of countries that are completely dependent on immigration have used it for great success to create a new middle class, to create social progress, and so on. Coming from Canada, we tend to naturally fall into this mindset. We're a country in which almost everybody, except for the 3% of the country who are the Aboriginal people of the country, the remaining 97% all have immigration backgrounds within a few generations themselves. So we don't have this natural sense that some people are immigrants and some people aren't. Nevertheless, there are political tensions over immigration. And I would argue that some of these successful immigration countries, such as Canada, have been more lucky and skillful in this, and that we had the right sort of urban neighborhoods at the right time, the right economies to make people succeed, and that in the future we're going to have to be skillful in making this succeed. Most European countries, most Western countries, are going to be depending on immigration during the coming decades. I would say here in the Slovak Republic, there's not a long history of immigration, and in fact Slovaks are more known as immigrants who have moved in large numbers to the countries of Central and Western Europe, seeking economic opportunities, and a substantial part of the economy of your country depends on relationships with those who've emigrated to other countries and the earnings they make there. Let's start with the basics, though. Who immigrates? What makes immigration happen in the world? Why do people suddenly show up in your country? from somewhere else who don't speak the language. So it only happens when an economy is doing well, when there are jobs. It was a very interesting experiment in immigration that happened starting in 2008 when the economies of the United States and the Eurozone went into an economic crisis for a number of years. And what we saw during that period was that immigration reversed. From the United States, there was a net outflow of people from the United States back into Central America and Mexico. From Western Europe, there was a net outflow of people from Europe to back to places like Turkey, Eastern Europe, North Africa, and so on. There was immigration going on during this period, but there were more people moving outward. When there are labor shortages, when the economy needs people, then people immigrate, whether it's legal or not. Nature abhors a vacuum, and when there are fewer working age people than there are jobs, immigration just tends to happen one way or another. So there's a popular myth that people will just show up in a country to sit back and receive benefits. That almost never happens. When things fail in the economy, then people do end up stuck in bad neighborhoods, receiving benefits and so on. The other thing is the question of who immigrates. There's a sort of popular notion that one country simply immigrates to another. You know, Turkey immigrated to Germany, something like that. Or Morocco to Spain. What actually happens everywhere in the world and throughout history is not that one country immigrates to another country, but a specific cluster of villages. It's usually, most immigration around the world is from a rural place to an urban place. A cluster of villages or a region within a country immigrates to a specific urban neighborhood or district. And what I explore in my book, Arrival City, is the relationship between specific urban districts and clusters of villages and places. Of the million Poles who immigrated to Britain and Ireland during the years after EU accession, almost all of them were from specific regions of Silesia and the southwest, and they migrated to very specific neighborhoods in London and Edinburgh and Dublin and so on, which maintained very close relationships back and forth. Very specific parts of the Rif Mountains of northern Morocco migrated to specific parts of Belgium and the Netherlands. You can map the streets of South Los Angeles to specific clusters of villages in Guatemala and Salvador and Honduras. And in fact, you find agencies that offer mortgage loans denominated in Central American currencies so that people can get mortgages for houses in the villages in Central America because of the lack of a banking system there that works very well. Once you understand this relationship between the sending villages and the urban neighborhood, you start to understand what can make immigration succeed as a source of upward mobility in a new middle class, or fail as a source of intergenerational poverty and violence and crime and so on. Because people use these urban neighborhoods as a launching pad, as a main source of finance for their villages, and as a launching pad for their success and their connection into the urban economy of the countries they moved into. And I call these urban districts arrival cities, partly to get away from the old images of them as being slums or ghettos or so on, to understand that their poverty is meant to be a transitional thing, is meant to be a move from the poverty of the village to the stability of urban work. And when these urban districts succeed for immigrants, what happens? People start off, well, let's talk about how people immigrate. When I started doing my work on this, I sort of imagined I would end up writing a chapter of a book that began with some family in a village somewhere, loading all of their possessions onto a bus and moving the whole family into the city. I thought, there's 25 million new urbanites created every month around the world. For sure, it should be easy to find a family moving all their things onto a train or a bus or something. This never happens anywhere in the world. the city to the village. This is the largest source of rural income now in China. It's the larger than all agriculture combined. It's the largest source of rural income in Morocco. It's the largest source of rural income in Bangladesh, and sometimes the largest source of income period in Bangladesh. It's the largest source of rural income in Poland, larger than all agricultural income, Polish subsidies, EU subsidies all combined. It's the money sent back from the oldest daughter cleaning office floors in London or something like that. And then eventually, people will try to buy some housing or rent some housing in the long term, maybe start a shop, start a small business, use their housing to borrow money from fellow villagers living in the city to start some form of economic life, employ some people from their village, bring further people over. It's what they call chain migration. People help each other out, use the rising economic activity of their urban district to finance future migration and then to facilitate the education of their children in the city. And at some point after maybe 10 years, 20 years, even 50 years, there's sort of a tipping point when the family realizes that they're no longer a rural family in country A with a few members of the family working in a city in country B, that they're now actually mostly an urban family living in country B that still has some ties to a village where Granny lives in country A. And that shifts. When immigration succeeds, this function is allowed to take place. These urban districts can work as places where people can start businesses, can form their own housing, can help each other mutually succeed without interference. When immigration fails and turns into poverty and violence and crime and so on, it's usually because this process has been interrupted in some way. This failure is often mistaken politically for something having to do with the culture or religion of the people who are immigrating. People say, okay, because this urban neighborhood turned into crime and violence and intergenerational poverty, it must be because they are Muslim, or because they are Orthodox Christian, or because they are African, or because they are Slavic, and so on. From country to country, the cultural theory varies. It's meant to explain why people have failed, but usually this is the case. It's possible to show why these explanations are wrong by looking at people who come from the same villages who immigrate to different countries, and realizing that they have extremely different outcomes depending what country or what city they go to. I followed people who came from the same villages in central Turkey, who came from the same level of rural poverty, who went to Istanbul, to London, and to Berlin. And one family became sort of a member of the successful new middle class of Turkey. The other family became a merchant family in London who were poor but whose kids were going to university and so on. And the third family became a member of this despised parallel society criminal underclass in Germany who were always on the covers of the tabloids because the Turks there were a failed integration story. Well, and politically, people said, oh, this must be their religion, or it must be their culture. Well, people with exactly the same background and same religion and culture actually became very successful in two other places, and they had this failed poverty experience in a third. You know it can't be their originating culture or religion is the problem. It must be something on the receiving end. So what are the factors that cause immigration to fail and to become a threat to countries? You need to look in the districts where people are actually living. One thing I should point out is that the places where immigrants first land, what I call arrival cities, they have a built-in problem. The thing that makes them be an arrival city is usually the thing that will make them fail at some point. Because what is an immigrant district? It is a neighborhood in the city that has housing costs that for some reason are much lower than anywhere else in the city. That somebody from a rural village from somewhere can afford to live in. What is it that causes, and the fact that these housing costs are so low makes these neighborhoods into the bottom rung on the ladder, a good place to put your feet at first to make a start somewhere. But whatever causes the housing costs to be low, maybe it's because this neighborhood is really far from the center of the city. It takes 2 hours on the bus to get there, 2 hours back. Okay, you're spending 2 hours on the bus to go to your probably something. During that time, your children are left with a big concrete area between the apartment buildings as their only form of childcare. No surprise they join a gang and get into trouble. Sometimes it's because the neighborhood has historically had problems or has bad quality housing, and nobody wants to go there. Sometimes it's because it's a type of buildings where nobody can start a shop or a restaurant or anything like that, so there's no way to make any money on your own. But generally the factors that prevent these things can be fixed. And we mistake the poverty of a failed immigrant neighborhood for a type of poverty which is cultural or built in, so we think that the solution is benefits or social work and so on. Often it's an intervention to fix that thing that's keeping it from being two rungs on the ladder. Or it's a problem in national policy that needs to be fixed because it's preventing immigrants to become full participants in the economy and the society. People will find ways to self-govern if they can't legally. People will turn to black market economies or will turn to organized crime or things like this if they can't make it in a legitimate economy. And a lot of the criminal problems arising from immigration and so on because people don't have the natural easy pathway into starting legal small businesses and so on. So the three factors that tend to cause immigration to fail or cause immigrant neighborhoods to become dangerous places or cause the children of immigrants to be worse off than their parents are physical factors having to do with the neighborhoods that people live in. As I said, often simply having better transit routes can actually turn a blighted and dangerous neighborhood into a safe one. Often street lighting, often giving people proper addresses, and so on. Giving people pathway to actually have a permanent hold on their housing. The second and very important thing, and this is very important in the European context, is citizenship factors. Is that one of the most dangerous things for any country is to have a large number of people living in its cities who are living on a more or less permanent basis in the city, but have no pathway to full legal citizenship. What happens if you're living in a city and you're working in a city and you have no access to becoming a citizen? You are not going to attempt to buy or have long-term lease on your housing. You are not going to put your children into university and probably won't even be concerned about having to finish secondary school because they have no access to that kind of education. You are not going to start a legal business beyond something like a kebab shop because you probably can't legally start either the business or the property. You basically are not going to invest in your neighborhood or your community or your future. You're going to send all your savings and investments back to the country you came from because that's the only place you can put it. So your neighborhood is going to get worse and worse rather than better and better. You're not going to be investing in your future. If you multiply that times millions of people, you get a serious problem. A lot of countries in the world right now are suffering serious problems because they have large populations living within their borders who have no access to citizenship. The United States has something like 10 million people who've come from Mexico and Central America over the last 50 years or so, whose children have no access to citizenship but are long-term residents. That is a huge problem in the United States. Germany ran into huge problems for many, many years because it had 3 million Turks who had brought in as so-called temporary workers who stayed longer, not because they wanted to stay longer, but because the companies that employed them wanted them to stay longer, because nobody wants to have a worker for only 2 years. And yet who they and their children and grandchildren had no access to citizenship until 1999, and even after that with problems. And no surprise, the Turks who moved there were not the immigration success story that Turks are in other countries. They became what were seen as a dangerous underclass because the only way they could make it was through black market, through criminal enterprises, or through connecting themselves to Turkey instead of to Germany. And we see Canada, which is widely regarded as an immigration success story, is having some problems now because they've shifted to a system of temporary worker visas. No, very, very few immigrants are ever temporary. And it makes sense. If you're 2 years, your company's going to want, even in an industrial job, in a factory, it takes 6 to 8 months before any worker is working at full capacity, even on a so-called unskilled job. So if you theoretically have a 2-year worker, it takes 8 months before they're really producing enough to make money. You're going to want to keep them on for longer, maybe 3 or 4 years. After 3 or 4 years, people fall in love, they have children, they develop relationships. Temporary immigration becomes permanent. So Canada now has, its biggest city, Toronto, now has 500,000 people who are more or less permanent residents who don't have an ability to vote in elections, which is a good sign that they're not citizens. And this is becoming a big social problem. The third factor that causes immigration failure, physical factors, citizenship factors. The third are bureaucratic factors, are rules that prevent immigrants from participating in the economy fully or from educating their children properly and succeeding. A lot of countries talk about integration policy, which is a complicated word. What does it mean to be integrated? I mean, you probably are going to keep your religion. You're probably going to eat some food that's a little different from other people. Most people are quite happy with that, and in most countries that's seen as a sign of success and diversity. It's nice to have people with a variety of foods and a variety of religions and who support a variety of football teams and this sort of thing. But if you have bureaucratic factors that keep them from participating, from the research I've done, I found that integration in the meaningful way means educational and employment integration. If people from an immigrant background are able to put their children through the same amount of schooling as the native-born people are, and if they're able to have a level of employment similar to the native-born people, then the cultural and linguistic factors will take care of themselves naturally. Their children will learn the language, their culture will be seen as a source of diversity rather than as a threat. I find that a lot of countries get very upset about trying to make people learn the language or trying to make people adopt the culture. If you can get the education and employment stuff right, then the cultural stuff takes care of itself. And there are a number of factors that prevent people from actually succeeding this way. Many countries have laws that prevent non-citizens from starting small businesses or from owning property. This is a huge barrier to this kind of success because people won't invest in their neighborhoods and so on. Many countries have schooling systems which make it very difficult for new immigrants to get out of the poverty trap of immigration. European school systems are particularly ill-designed for bringing new immigrants into the center of the economy. Too many countries still have half-day schooling, which is bad enough for the native-born population. It prevents women from entering the workforce. It prevents children from really getting the kind of education they need. But for new immigrants, it's disastrous because it encourages people to keep their kids out of school and to not participate in schooling. Many countries still have school systems in which if children fail because of linguistic abilities, they're held back a year. So rather than progressing through primary and secondary school by age, they progress by ability. And this is basically an incentive for the male children, especially of immigrants, to drop out of school at age 16 or whatever the legal minimum age is. This is a huge problem in many countries. Incentives built into the schooling system, or systems in which children are streamed into vocational or university-bound paths at age 11 or 12 or 13 or 14. Again, for the kids coming up from immigrant backgrounds, this essentially dooms them because in most countries, these systems will sort of, on racial or religious grounds, will look at kids from these immigrant backgrounds and channel them immediately into the vocational stream without even thinking about their ability or anything like that. And in most of the countries in Europe I visited, the largest source of failure of immigration, of immigrant neighborhoods becoming dangerous places, is education systems that have incentives to exclude people, because many of the daughters tend to do better in the education system, but the sons of immigrants to drop out at age 16, and you then have this underclass who are depending on gray market or crime to get by further. These things can be reversed through intelligent policy and incentives and so on. We've seen countries that have had including Britain, that have had bad experiences with immigration, turn those bad neighborhoods into good neighborhoods by intervening in the education system, by intervening in the right to own property, by putting people on a pathway to full legal citizenship, by providing amnesties, as Spain did, to say, okay, if we have 700,000 people who have legal citizenship, let's give them citizenship right now and cause them to invest in their communities. So, in the larger picture, I'd say that we need to get some perspective here, realize that large-scale immigration is going to be part of the European and North American experience throughout the next 50 or so years until the whole world population starts dropping and there will be sources of immigration. And then we need to understand how to make it work to our benefit rather than become a threat to us.
Thank you, Dan. When I go to Tom Nicholson, who made Slovakia its home for the last 20 years, are there any lessons you think that Slovaks can learn from Canada or vice versa?
That's a very good question. Quite often, I think Canada tends to export multiculturalism as a policy and say this is the way to go, not perhaps being sensitive enough to conditions in the countries which make it rather difficult for that country to take on this as a policy. Just to give you an example, in Canada I went to a private school, not because I was rich, my father was a teacher there, so I got to go for free, but my three best friends, their name was Rob Finkenstein, Jimmy Piasecki, and Chris Humenek. Humenek is a Ukrainian name, Piasecki is Polish, Finkenstein was German, and we were all born in another country. I was born in England. But we looked the same, talked the same as everybody else, and this was a very establishment school. That gives you an idea of what Canadian society looks like. Canada is a country that was built on immigration. And studying history, I've forgotten most of it, but I remember a few things, such as in the late 19th century, Canada became a country and decided they had to open up the West, which means to populate, to create farms there. So we had an interior minister, Clifford Sifton, who made a European tour and tried to convince Europeans to come to Canada as a country we're visiting. So for over 120 years, Canada is a country which has not only welcomed immigrants, but has actively courted them. And the result is a country which has over a century of experience in bringing immigrants over, getting them somehow involved in Canadian society, and a population which doesn't even question immigration as a need. It's just a natural thing. There are always going to be small problems. I mean, the Finns brought over some socialism, and the Italians would be drunk in a mining camp, and that kind of thing. But these are just minor irritations compared to the benefits of immigration to Canada. Compare that to Slovakia. I go around to high schools now, trying to talk to people about corruption and this state. And you look down the list of students, and you may occasionally see a German-looking name or a Hungarian name, but there's nothing like the diversity that Canada has. So one of the main differences is that Canada has so many more years of experience of immigration and people just being used to it as a part of the country. Slovakia doesn't have that. At the same time, I think this is a country that is very soon going to have a very serious problem. When I go around to these high schools, one of the things I ask is, do you love this country? What are you proud of? And people have lots of things to say: culture, language, food, girls. They never say Slovak men, it's always the Slovak girls that people are excited about. But then I ask them, well, how many of you, if you could, have ever considered leaving Slovakia to go somewhere else? And at least half people put their hands up. And the further you go east, some people even put two hands up, every show places like that. Which is a paradox, right? I mean, people are essentially happy to be Slovak, happy with their country, but most of the young people have at least thought about going away. And this is something you really don't see talked about much in the press. Certainly not politicians don't basically stealing them away from this country. But who's coming in? That's the big question, and I'm sure Zuzana will have more to talk about migration policy and so on, but there are a few other reasons why multiculturalism, immigration, and diversity isn't a natural fit in Slovakia. And I think one of them is, it's controversial to talk about, but I still think it needs to be said. There's never really been a big immigration success story in Slovakia. Not only do we have very few individual success stories to look at, I'm not counting people like Ibrahim Maika or Maki Sadiki. There are relatively few people who have come here, set up a business, or gone through all the levels and become successful and entered the middle class. There's not much of a middle class here either. Let's be realistic. But what we do have are a lot of examples of crime. For example, connected to the Albanian community. I'm absolutely far from saying that Albanians are criminally minded and so on, but there definitely was, during the Yugoslav wars, a sense in which Albanians were using Slovakia and other countries as a way to make money to fund resistance in Kosovo. Russians, Ukrainians, police have a view of them. Why would a Russian, why would a Ukrainian be in Slovakia if not for crime? Of course, it's a terrible slight against Russians and Ukrainians to think that. But there is a sense, also backed up by police work, that a number of immigrants in this country have come for other than standard reasons of moving and trying to make better lives. So there are not a lot of positive examples that Slovaks can look at and say, hey, it actually does work. And finally, I don't think we have a government which gets it. Not only is there an abysmal failure to use a very large pool of human resources, Roma, almost 10% of the country's population, very few of whom actually participate in the labor force. That's been just neglected as a problem for 20-odd years. But I've never seen any kind of active government policy trying to convince, trying to do what Canada does and go to other countries, market Slovakia as a place people might want to come and work. So far, so good. We do have large unemployment and so on, but I'm not sure this is a long-term thing. So even though while I realize why Slovakia might not be a natural fit for the Canadian experiment, the Canadian way of doing things, I don't think this is something that the country can continue for too much longer.
Thank you, Tom. We're now with Zuzana, and your organization wants immigrants to be treated well and have opportunities. Would you give us a little report on how it's working in Slovakia? No, how the immigrants are integrated into Slovak society.
Well, let me shortly react to some of what was already said and build up on that. I have to say, Tom, that I don't quite agree that there are not enough good examples of foreigners here in Slovakia legally residing here, living decent and successful life. There are, we know of many of them through our Migrant Information Center. They are just not so visible. They are certainly not in the media, they are not topic for media. And the examples that you are talking about, they tend to be more illegal migrants who are caught here, who are involved in criminal acts and who are in media because that is sexy, that is bad news, so it's good news for the media, it's bad news. Indeed, Slovakia is a country of very few migrants. It's compared to other 27 EU countries, Slovakia is somewhere at the end, third or second from the end, with the number of foreign people residing legally in the country. It's around 1.25%, out of which, as you know, half of them are EU citizens, which is not quite foreigners. When you talk about integration, when you talk about their conditions for living here in Slovakia, it's quite different from people who are coming from countries outside of the European Union. So indeed, Slovakia is a very white, very Christian country, and not very diverse, which also has an effect and impact on how people are receiving migrants and how people are kind of perceiving anybody who's different, who's coming from different countries, who's coming from different culture. When you ask about the example that can Slovakia take from Canada, I agree that culturally this will not change. Slovakia will never be immigrant country, will never be a country that will sense of immigration like Canada, but I think that Slovakia can learn from kind of pragmatic point of view. Because in Canada it's not only about people loving people, but it's also about economy. It's also about taking advantage in good sense from immigration, from immigrants. And that is something that I think Slovakia can learn, and that we as an organization are also trying to help the country to learn from it and to act on it. Slovakia does have a migration policy. It's a small booklet, in both languages already. It's a very tiny policy. And the policy does count on migration, on immigration, and the policy, there aren't too many foreigners. People who are bright and smart or tend to leave Slovakia and are leaving Slovakia actually, because you can see in 2008 the estimates were that over 200,000 Slovaks are working abroad, and those are indeed Slovaks who are well educated. Another issue that we don't even want to start here is that they're well educated from Slovakia and they work in much less demanding jobs abroad, so it's really a waste of brains, not even brain drain, but brain waste. But those people who are coming to Slovakia, there's some 64,000 of them legally residing in Slovakia. Like I said, half of them are from European Union countries. Their profile would be that a typical foreigner legally residing in Slovakia would be EU citizen, would be around 30 years of age, it would be a male statistically, and it would be a middle or highly educated person who came to work to Slovakia, which is ideal migrant for the country. Perfectly ideal. The issue is here for us as an organization as well that there are not enough of them. It seems like what we have here in Slovakia are the good migrants that we want here, but in reality simply there isn't enough of them. Because in spite of 14% unemployment rate, somewhere around 14, depending on methodology used, whatever, it's still 14. Remember times when in 2008 there was 8-9% unemployment rate, and estimates there were that 75% of those 9%, 3/4, are long-term unemployed people. So basically people that you cannot count on, even if you do have jobs on the labor market. You can count on them only if you work with them in the long term, if you educate them, if you bring them back to the labor market. So our estimate is that already in this situation, in spite of economic crisis, the Slovak labor market could absorb migrants. The issue is that migrants are not interested in Slovakia. So Slovakia is in a situation when the labor market does need certainly certain sectors, like health sector is quite a clear example of a sector in need of labor force that is not available here in Slovakia, and what is available if you need Slovakia. But on the other hand, in spite of the policy, not much is being done. You already touched upon, it seems like not only this government, but the previous governments as well were too afraid to talk about migration, were too afraid to open labor market, publicly open labor market to immigrants, but also to adopt legislation that would enable it. Because according to our opinion, there are two levels. You can go public with it, you can do a campaign, you can say, let's open up to immigration because we need them for these and these reasons, which I can understand that from a certain point of view it can be politically sensitive, but there is also other way. You don't have to go public, but you enable it. You have instruments, you have measures in the legal system that enables it. In spite of migration policy, the Slovak system is still very rigid. We talk about citizenship. I doubt there is any country anywhere near where it's so difficult to get citizenship like in Slovakia. So we are not even touching on citizenship yet. We are only talking about permit to stay in the country, permit to work in the country. Only recently changed from 1 year to 2 years. And we have exactly the same experience with employers as you talked about, that if they train a person from abroad, they don't want to let the person go after 1 year or 2 years. And this is what Slovakia is doing deliberately, politically, that if they allow an employer to employ a third country national, they, after work permit expires, they have to evaluate whether the employer still needs somebody from abroad. So the employers are kind of pushed to employ Slovaks, which is, I know it is difficult and complicated situation if you have a high unemployment rate. On the other side, from the point of view of employer who's private business, of course, once he invested in a person that is already trained, he tends to continue the employment of a foreigner. I also wanted to slightly comment on what you said at the beginning, that if economy is successful, the country will need immigrants. I think that's it may not be successful because it misses immigrants. There's also an issue of how to become successful. Because we remember when Slovakia in 2008, when GDP grew by 10% per year, literally the labor force was missing here. And it was not highly qualified. It was not all even qualified people that were missing. People with simple manual abilities were missing at construction sites, etc. And I think that Slovakia will come back to this situation very soon, sooner than later. So coming back to the question of what type of migrants are in Slovakia, our experience is that usually they are legally residing here. If you compare the statistics numbers, vast majority of migrants are legally here and are working here. They are contributing to the economy. In spite of the fact that society tends to perceive them as somebody who's taking from the system, they are actually adding to the system. They are paying taxes, they are paying to social security and health security, etc. And on contrary, during the first couple of years, they even cannot take out of the system because they're not eligible for it.
Well, having come to Canada as an immigrant, one thing that sticks in my mind when I look back and I look at immigrants arriving to Canada right now, and that's Aula. The country is remarkable at all when it comes to immigration, when it comes to people, customs, etc. What are the key factors? What key factors do you see in Canada help people to accept it? One of the factors that I tend to think about is issue. I mean, you have to treat everything well, and that's probably a lot of factors. And nobody can go around it. What's your feel about that?
Yes, I mean, Canada shifted in 1981-82 to a legal and constitutional system that was based on fundamental individual rights by introducing a charter of rights and freedoms, which did help a lot. I mean, that sense of having a stable rule of law and judiciary able to enforce it based on individual rights. It helps a lot because before that, a lot of sort of the foundations of how Canada worked were based on sort of group identities, and that shift coincided. I mean, Canada tends to forget that its own history was not entirely so easy with immigration. That there were tensions over these things. Before about 1967, Canada saw itself very much as a British country, or at least the 9 provinces of English Canada saw themselves as an English country, and Quebec saw itself in its own post-colonial way. And that until some period after 1967, the general identity was that in most of Canada that if you were of British descent, not even necessarily Irish descent, that you were a real Canadian, and that anyone whose religion wasn't Christian, or whose skin wasn't white, or whose history wasn't British, wasn't really a Canadian, even if you'd been there for 60 or 70 years. In the 1950s, when hundreds of thousands of Italians started coming into Canada, there were people in the government who said, these people cannot possibly be integrated into Canada. We can't allow Italians. They're from an alien civilization that could never be compatible with ours. They're from a Roman Catholic faith. They're from a place whose ways are too difficult. There were government officials who wrote this. This is a clash of civilizations allowing the Italians in. And it really was just the experience of actually living among people who were different that changed things, of allowing people to have an economic foundation that worked, allowing them to have an educational foundation that worked, that changed things. Yes, Toronto is now a city where 4 out of 10, it's a city of 4 million people, and 4 out of 10 of its residents were born in another country, which does mean that you can't really call anyone history of dealing with its own internal minorities. The First Nations and the Inuit, what people here might know as the Indians and Eskimos, who represent only about 3% of the population, but who were horrifically mistreated in the history of, until quite recently and arguably even still today, and who are an internal failure of multiculturalism. But allowing immigration to work slowly is part of what has succeeded. I grew up in neighborhoods in Toronto where almost everybody around me was born on a mud floor in a peasant village somewhere, either in Guangdong in China or in Abruzzo in Italy or in places like that. Yeah, people who immigrate are probably not going to learn the language. They're probably not going to be a lot like me. They're going to have some weird customs, but their children are going to do fine. Their children, if they enter the school system, they learn English even more quickly than my own children do. Most of my kids, my children are 8 and 12 years old. Most of their classmates have parents who don't speak a word of English. But they learn English just fine. And I think at first that was a shock to the system. And I would say that a lot of countries are going to experience this. I would say that it's that Slovakia is not going to be a new ethnic country for very much longer, because of the realities of the population and of the economy, that there will be large groups of people of different languages and backgrounds living here within a few years. And hopefully that sort of patience and the thing I spoke to earlier, the attention to making sure that things are done right for people, will make people as patient as they have learned to be in Canada. But again, we shouldn't pretend that we're just naturally born to be like this. It was through hard experience that we learned to have this kind of patience.
No? What's your feeling on?
I agree with Doug that it's never been without problems in Canada. And I remember when I moved back in 2003 with my wife and son to try and move back to Canada. As you can stated that very few immigrants are temporary residents is absolutely true. I mean, I'm in Slovakia 20 years later for that very reason. And I found, even among my friends, a very disconcerting not hostility exactly, but when you go to a dinner party, many times they would interrupt her. Her English wasn't perfect, but it was very good. But humor is difficult for immigrants and that kind of thing. And in Slovakia, conversely, I've been treated with absolute politeness everywhere I've gone. People let you struggle along in Slovak even though they can't really understand what you're saying. But in Canada, they kept interrupting, and I was aware of sort of immigrant fatigue, I think, in the last 10 years or so, that it's become so, I guess the last 20 years or so, it's really gone ahead full steam. And it is changing the fabric of the country. It's changing communities, people. You go on the subway, things just look different in Toronto. And so I think as much as it has been a success story for the country, it's still not without thorns. But I have a feeling that a lot of this has to do with wealth. I think in a country that is essentially wealthy, that has a large middle class and opportunities for people who graduate with university degrees, people can broadly tolerate immigration. But in a country like Slovakia, where there's still a lot of people earning 350 euros a month working at Kaufland, or struggling to get jobs as laborers and then get paid once they've done the job. Or you find teachers beginning salary at 500 euros a month. You know, it's not a rich country, and I think many people feel threatened by the whole idea of immigration, because they have these ideas that the Romanians are going to come, the Bulgarians, the Ukrainians, they're going to undercut our wages. I think Slovakia still has a ways to go in terms of its economy and just the wealth of the country before people can feel easy in their souls about the prospect of immigration.
Zuzana?
I do have some experience with Canada for the past couple of months there and lived there and everything. And as an outsider, I could see that people were kind of proud to be aspire to become Canadian. And I think this is a huge difference between Canada and not only Canada and Slovakia, but many other countries. Because in Slovakia, we tend to take ourselves as Slovaks by blood. But in Canada, it's kind of Canadian, to be Canadian, it's to be part of society. It's not perceived as being Canadian by blood. And I think it makes it much easier to accept other people, not only tolerate, but to accept them. And of course there are tensions, and of course Slovaks living in Canada think that there are more than Chinese living in Canada, and then people from Pakistan living in Canada, so it is there are differences, but nobody dares to say it openly, because they know that it's implied, and it's somehow in society, generally. And I think that goes for corruption and other things in society, but this is one of them. That there's a notion that this is simply not right to feel above somebody. Because to tolerate migrants, that is the least. We would aspire to accept them in the society, not only tolerate them.
That's actually a very important point. And one of the main differences between Canada and Slovakia is that Canada has a strong national community of people who believe in the same things and aspire to the same things, and that doesn't exist in Slovakia. Slovakia is still basically a country of tribes. People achieve things through family, friends, acquaintances, classmates, where you come from. These are all very important ways of negotiating your way through life. But we don't really have a national community, a statewide community of people who believe in the same things about Slovakia. And in Canada, there are so many immigrants, Chinese Canadians, Jamaican Canadians, and German Canadians. Unless you had a very strong sense of the nation, what this country is all about, then I don't think it would work. And I think immigrants coming to Slovakia, because it's such a tribal place, we find it very difficult to be accepted within that tribal mentality.
Yeah, you brought up an interesting point about community. I've been living here for a couple of years now. Probably I'll be here another year or so. And the biggest difference I found between Slovakia and Canada is the lack of community. This community feeling. Slovaks are almost obsessive about cleanliness. You go to Slovak homes and everything is, you have to take your shoes off, you almost have to wash your feet. Everything is perfect. As soon as they go outside, stuff gets dropped. I mean, there is, I'll give you an example from a little town where I live in Canada. When we walk and we see, garbage on the street, we pick it up after each other, or somebody's dog made a poo-poo on the sidewalk, and we assume that the person simply didn't have bag to clean it up, and we clean it. I don't see that in Slovakia. So I tried to sort of figure out why it is, and the closest I could come, there's a book by a Czech psychologist called called History Communism, I believe, and he discusses what happened to this society under communism, where people were driven into families. As you said, they had to stick together because family was the only protection you essentially got. And to a certain extent, it still exists in Slovakia today. We talk tolerance, we talk education, and when it comes to Canadian education, it's frankly second to none. I mean, it's basically public, unlike in the States where it's private, and you see Canadian universities hitting the first 50, no problem in the world, no problem whatsoever. Is there an attempt to integrate immigrants that come to this country through education, Zuzana, or how does it work?
Very much depends on where does the migrant come from, whether it's a third country national or whether it's EU citizen, and also whether it's the basic school, because every parent is obliged by the law, of course, to send children to school, or whether it's secondary education or university education. Then it may differ whether people can enter the school free of charge or they have to pay. But basically, once people live here, once families are here, they have to send children to school. And I must say that also we see that it does work, that children who are going to school in Slovakia learn Slovak language much easier than their parents. isn't a system, certainly not for third country nationals, that would help either adult migrants or children with the Slovak language so that they can catch up. But with children, it is much easier than with adults to learn Slovak and to integrate into society in general. And you can see that migrant children tend to be much better off at school than Slovak children because they're trying harder, because they're driven by their parents to try harder to be more successful, to have better lives than their parents have. So this pattern that works everywhere in the world works also in Slovakia. So it is happening in Slovakia, but since there are so few of them, there are schools in Slovakia that really appreciate having foreign children and build their activities on it. And they're organizing discussions, and they're bringing people to school to talk about different societies, and they do multiculturalism education just through having a couple of children from other countries. But there are also schools where children are suffering because they don't speak Slovak well, because they are from other countries.
Thank you. One thing I noticed is the second generations in Canada, who basically so integrated that when they leave Canada and they visit Europe, everybody seems, this is, in one case, my daughter works for an insurance company, and her co-worker is an Indian person, and speaks perfect English, obviously, graduated from a couple of universities in Canada, and he almost cannot understand that people who see that he's thinking, he sees himself as a Canadian. People would start talking Hindu to him, or Hinduism, and he just says, I'm sorry, it's not exactly my first language. Where do you see the future of this society, which in our case, of course, is rather multicultural, but it seems to be going the non-equal way, in a sense?
You know, one of the things I found, the word multicultural got used by members of our generation in Canada over and over again. We like to say that. We had no idea what it really meant. Other than we like to have a lot of different restaurants around to eat at. That's not a small thing, actually. It's nice to have a lot of restaurants. And in fact, the ethnic restaurant is a very important part of the founding economy for an immigrant. But what I've found is that the people your age, the children of immigrants, who've grown up in Canada, really don't like the word multiculturalism. They don't like the concept either. They don't like the idea that there's policies that say you have to be the Chinese or the Muslim or the African or whatever. That doesn't mean they want to become exactly like me, become some stereotypical average Canadian or something like that. They want to maintain their religion and their family's food, and maybe even keep supporting the sports team from where their parents came from and that sort of thing. But they don't like the idea of having to have a cultural model imposed on you, because immigration is a shock, right? I mean, it is a cultural change. Immigrants don't bring the culture from their country over and impose it and so on. Nor do they adopt the culture of the new country. They have something that's a weird hybrid that sometimes is more conservative than the culture of the place they've come from, because you become very insecure and protective of yourself. You sometimes develop a weird version of it. Like, there's been a lot of studies of this. People who immigrate from one country, people who are immigrants themselves try to become just the same. Their children actually start adopting a weird cartoon version of their parents' culture. They become, okay, if they're from Slovakia, their kids might become sort of ultra Slavs and so that sort of thing, and exaggerated versions of it. I have to say that's not really true of Slovaks. I know in Canada or Britain and so on. I know Slovaks all over the place because they're working all over the world, often doing crummy jobs, because crummy jobs in Britain and Canada and so on pay better than good jobs here. And so on. But it's a cultural shock that takes 2 or 3 generations for people to completely adjust to decide who they are. I think people can understand that here. There's not an immigration experience here, but there is a post-totalitarian experience here.
something to add to that? We can go to questions right now. We don't have any microphones there, right?
That's okay. They can
Just a sec, I'll bring the microphone in.
very much. I'd like to pick up the point that Tom was saying about the lack of national identity, and I would actually disagree because I think there is a strong national identity, but it's based on very different values than in Canada. It's very exclusionary. And I think that's the core of the number of dilemmas, also what Lopita said, because for example, when we talk about integration of Roma, and I think that exactly the same model would apply. You have to focus on education, employment, but simply it's difficult to convince people and difficult to convince politicians to create a space for integration because simply Slovaks are not willing to sort of open that space, open that school so Roma can be equally sitting, they don't have to be segregated and so on. And the question that I have for that is how do you think that Canada has changed its identity being multicultural, understanding that everybody is equally valuable than ever? Because in Slovakia I have a feeling that it's very difficult, I come from an NGO sector, it's very difficult to tell the alternative story because Slovaks somehow feel and they get it from literature, they get it from TV, they should threaten the Roma, they should be, they should be afraid of Roma, they should be afraid of migrants, they should be afraid of Hungarians, whatever. So I think it may depend, my speculation is that it has to do something with being conscious, being okay with themselves, but maybe.
Yeah, this is a good question. I think a lot of people here, when they think about the immigrant experiences of other countries, what they often first think about is relations with the Roma within this country, who of course are not immigrants. They're as established Europeans as anyone else, but come from a group of people whose experience has some of the aspects that immigration does, but many that are not, which is the formerly nomadic and tribal people of the Western world, which includes the Roma and Sinti here. It includes in Canada the First Nations and the Inuit, the Aboriginal people of South America and Australia, of Northern Scandinavia and Russia, and so on. All of which have similar relationships with the larger society, which is one of both having been very exploited and mistreated, and also having really terrible cultural clashes having to do with the incompatibilities of formerly nomadic societies with urban societies. And these situations tend to get worse and worse. Canada offers very few great lessons for this because our own relationship with attempting to integrate our own formerly tribal and nomadic peoples was disastrous, often trying to force them into urban lives, to force them into schooling, to take them out of schools and put them into residential schools, which were terribly abusive and scarred multiple generations and made the situation much, much worse. I think one of the flaws that Canada experienced that may be a good negative lesson for people with regard to Roma and other such populations was that we for many years thought that this was a population who should be integrated the way immigrants are. But of course they're not coming in the way immigrants are and seeking work there and seeking to become part of the urban society. These are people who have their own established ways of life. That Canada, with its own formerly tribal and nomadic populations, is still suffering the damage done from policies along those lines. So we shouldn't mistake this population of our own encounters with our own indigenous populations with the experience of immigration, which is very, very different.
Thank you, Don. Any more questions?
This was something I wanted to add to that point. The question of nation is very interesting because in Slovakia narod tends to be an ethnic nation. And so yeah, Slovakia does have a very well-defined ethnic nation, but not a political nation. And And Slovakia, if you ask Slovaks, what is Slovakia all about, they can talk about hockey and culture and so on. But if you say, no, I'm talking about the state, the nation state of Slovakia, what's that about? And when they realize, well, that involves the Roma, the Hungarians, the Ruthenians, and so on and so on, it's very difficult for them to say something about it. Because, as you say, the ethnic Slovak nation is very exclusionary. I live in Sveti Jur, and I live beside a guy who comes from Grinjava, which is 3 kilometers away, and he's been living there for 30 years, and they still call him Cespolia, the guy who came across the fields. So, if between villages there can be this sense of, he's not from around here, then obviously the immigrants are going to find it incredibly difficult to integrate.
The other thing that's interesting about Czechs and Slovaks, there was a survey done in the US. People are trying to find out which groups integrate the fastest into society, and Czechs and Slovaks, of course, Czech and Slovaks were number one. I don't know what it is right now, and I don't remember exactly when the survey was taken, but it's interesting about Slovaks, because I don't remember any Slovak communities in either Canada or the US. I mean, when we came in 1968, there was a bit of resentment between the immigration from 1948-49 because they didn't have the opportunities we had. I mean, we came here, we learned English, boom, we went to universities, break our degrees, and move up really fast. So we had it incredibly easy. I don't blame them for not liking us too much on that point. Okay, here's the next question.
Hi. You mentioned mostly only one group of immigrants, and I'd like to point out that maybe it gives a false impression that all immigrants are poor and from rural countries, but in my experience there are a lot of wealthy kind of or middle class or wealthy immigrants. Because I'm from Vancouver, and that's a place where a lot of the, let's say, wealthy Asian immigrants go. And I think maybe it's fair to mention that there are more types of immigrants. And also, there might be some problems associated with that as well, as it's perceived that they bring a lot of wealth, which is good for the economy in one way, but in the other way they end up buying a lot of properties, which drives the values up. And it's a problem when people already live over there. And I don't know if in the future it might happen here as well. But I don't know.
Yes, there will always be wealthy people who, established middle-class people who move between countries. Generally, they have little difficulty doing so because if you have money you're bringing with you, most countries are happy to allow you in. It's never going to be the largest bunch of immigration. It's never going to be the immigration that causes the big controversies. In the Canadian experience, it's a little more interesting because Canada likes to think that it has changed its immigration system so that all the people coming in are university educated, fluent in English and French, and so on. It's a points-based immigration system where to become a primary immigrant, you have to fulfill a set of criteria: post-secondary education, English or French fluency, or if you have a certain amount of money, then you can overcome all of those things and buy your way in, essentially. But interestingly, that has actually not changed the amounts of low-income immigration at all, for the simple reason that for every one immigrant who comes in on this point system, on average they bring in about 4 people who are relatives, either with them when they initially come or sponsored later on. And those relatives they bring in tend to be non-university educated, non-English or French fluent, often from a more village background, and so on. Because they're often and semi-skilled areas. So we have this phenomenon. It's all the cliche that every taxi driver in Toronto, and taxi driving is a very poor job in Canada, and that every taxi driver in Toronto has a PhD. And it's largely true. Whenever I take a taxi in Toronto, I ask the driver about their education, where they came from. And they all have like, oh yeah, I have one master's degree from Addis Ababa University and another doctorate from another place and so on. I don't think I've ever had a taxi driver who has less education than I do. And that's because there actually are not a lot of, there are shortages, we need x-ray technicians and that sort of thing, but there actually are not that many job shortages for people with advanced degrees. There are a lot of job shortages for hotel desk clerks, for oil rig workers, and that sort of thing. So they come in with a PhD, they end up driving a taxi. Their wife and their oldest daughter, who don't have any education, immediately get full-time jobs in hotels or this sort of thing, and become the primary income earners. So the Canadian experience is very, very complicated that way. Yes, there are wealthy middle-class people. They will always be in the background. They will never be sort of key to a country. Yes, they drive up property prices in some places, London especially. Although you don't actually need to immigrate to drive up the property prices, right? I mean, I've lived in London for years. I could never afford to buy a house in London, not because of immigrants coming in and buying my houses, because of people who live in Dubai or Athens or Aula in Bratislava who don't trust their own country's banking system or political system. When they make some money, they decide to put it somewhere safe. That's into London property or into Vancouver property or so on. The real estate in the big cities of the world has become the favorite savings account for middle-class people and wealthy people all over the place, and that's driving up housing prices in a dangerous way. That's a whole other story, though, really.
Thank you, Doug. Do we have any more questions?
Bring the microphone.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Zuzana Vatralova from the Human Rights League, and I have the question because we are talking about the integration of migrants and about actually migration that has positive effects on economy and demography, etc. And all of you, the panelists, touch upon the important issue that unfortunately migration is not a topic in our political debate or in a social debate. So I'm asking you, do you think there is some recipe how to make it a topic in a public discussion, how to make the politicians and ministries to understand that migration really should be a topic they should deal with openly? Thank you.
Obviously, we're all happy to answer. Honestly, I don't think there's a recipe. We've been involved in exchange of best practices for maybe 6 years now here in Slovakia. We've been trying to bring all kinds of good practice or lessons learned from countries that succeeded or did not succeed with integration or immigration policy or anything related to that. We tried mostly European countries, and it turns out that every success story or even lessons learned in the worst case, something that we can learn from, everywhere, whether it's municipality or the state, they started to act when they had a problem. So there was not a question of kind of convincing the government to talk about it or to adopt this topic, since the situation developed this way. We in Slovakia have been trying for years now to explain to governments and counterparts, and to a certain extent the situation develops, well, we know very well, it develops and it moves a certain way, and migration policy is one of the examples. There's integration policy being prepared at the moment, etc. So things are happening, although not so visibly, and more on kind of paper level rather than in reality. But we're trying to convince them that, listen, Slovakia is in a very advantageous position in our opinion. So you can learn from other countries, you can learn what worked there, what didn't work, and how to adopt it to Slovakia. But as you know, we haven't been too successful to convince them that let's start doing it. If not talking about it, at least analyzing it and on a small scale, start some activities. There are activities here and there. There are projects that are very useful for migrants that are helping them on kind of ground level, but systematically, and how to convince them to talk about it. Well, you know, there are opportunities, there are conferences simply say, yes, we are going for it, we are opening it. So actually, in spite of all I'm talking, I don't have an answer.
I think one of the most important things is to realize where we are. I think we're living in a dream world. You still have people like Ivan Miklos saying, it's good that students go and study abroad, they get some experience, come back after a couple of years, but I don't think that happens. And the reason it happens is not simply beginnings are difficult. When you move to a foreign country, it's much harder than you think it's going to be. Go to England, go to Germany, they've got tons of thousands of Poles, Slovak, they don't care about you. So you end up with a crappy job, and after a couple of years, when you finally get a better job, you make some friends, you have some social network, maybe you get married, that kind of stuff. You're not. When does it happen? After 3 years, you look at your watch and say it's time to go back to Slovak. It doesn't happen, because those are things that you have fought for and you've achieved through your hard work and your persistence and so on. And I don't think people give those up. And if they do come back to Slovakia, it's often too late. It's after 10 years, 15 years, and people they can't get back into the stream, looking at a hospital bothers them. It bothers them to see garbage in the streets. It bothers them the way people behave to each other. It bothers them to see corruption in public life. I think this is a really serious thing that we need to talk about, that people in positions of power are ignoring. And until people realize that we're headed down a really, not a dangerous path, but it's got one end. There's no way we can have a discussion about immigration, because we're not talking about emigration. We're not talking about the fact that everybody of your age and my age is making other plans for retirement, because we know full well there's going to be no money left in the pension system. These are things I just think we're